Welcome to The Kingstonian, a podcast that profiles individuals who are passionate about what they do for a living, about what organization they belong to, or simply passionate about the community they are a part of. Hello there, and welcome. My name is Dave Cunningham. Consider this episode to be a bit of a sequel to the show aired last week. You may recall we profiled the Rob Roy Pipe Band and Highland Dancers as they traveled to New York City to participate in the Tartan Day Parade. While there, we had the opportunity to meet Darryl Lim, invited by Rob Roy to be their guest drum major for the weekend. Darryl joined his first pipe band as a 12-year-old in Singapore. He now lives in Ottawa, focuses on his twin passions of drumming and his role as a drum major. A note about the sound quality. We recorded our chat online, so the audio isn't as even as we'd like it to be. Here is our conversation with Darryl Lim. So, Darryl, thank you very much for participating in the program today.
Thanks for having me.
We want to talk a little bit about the Tartan Day Parade, but before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about your history with piping. Now, when did you get started in participating in a pipe band?
I actually started at the age of 12 back in my home country of Singapore, and I joined an organization called the Boys Brigade. And the Boys Brigade has its roots in Glasgow, and obviously when they expanded the Boys Brigade program, bagpipes, was one pillar. I used to say, between the Scouts and the Boys Brigade, the only difference the Boys Brigade has is Christian education and bagpipes. And so the sound of the bagpipes allured me during the high school recruitment. And, I joined as a piper, and I spent about a year as a piper. And then I switched to drumming only because, back when you're a 12-year-old kid, when you don't have your full lung capacity, all the drummers are on parade within 6 months while pipers are still trying to hack it on chanters. So I made that fateful switch at the age of 14 to become a snare drummer. But that in 1993 was what launched me into my piping and drumming pipe band career, as I call it. It's been 26 years. So.
I'm always amazed about how popular being in a pipe band is around the world, because most people would associate most of the pipe band activity as taking place in Scotland. But I know it's popular in the Middle East and in the Far East. Any sense as to why that is?
Well, certainly in Singapore is well known as one of the highest concentrations of pipe bands outside of the Western Hemisphere. And, I tell a story when I go to a lot of Highland Games today when people ask me to go, I'm Asian of Asian ethnicity. And people look at me and they go, well, Asian person in a kilt, that's kind of odd. And I actually relate the story, and you've heard me say it many times. People who, I said I grew up in a world where we competed in Asian Highland Games in Jakarta. Singapore hosts one of the Southeast Asian Pipe Band Championships annually now. And I go, you go to these games and the only white people there in kilts are the ones from the St. Andrews Society. And you find that a little bit odd. So it's all context. But I find that the Great Highland Bagpipe, there are also different forms of bagpipes, but the Great Highland Bagpipe was certainly expanded across the world, especially during the British Empire when they had different. Singapore was a former British colony. Hong Kong, for example, India. These are anywhere that was a colonized by the British or the Western, the Dutch. They would have a fair, heavy colonial history, but also tradition. So the bagpipes was, is in a way today Asian countries that have a cultural, still a heavy presence of the culture of like bagpipes, for example, would likely be a former colony of the British Empire.
Right. Okay. When you were in Singapore participating in bands there, was there more competition than performance or the other way around?
The performance element was present. Certainly with the high school band I was in, we did not compete the same way that competitions are, happen almost every other weekend here on the Ontario circuit. We had one major competition well, there was one competition every year. Back then when I was growing up was the Jakarta Highland Gathering that was held in Jakarta, Indonesia, where all these bands from, around Asia would congregate and meet once a year. That same event, the Jakarta Highland Gathering, has now actually moved to Singapore, my home country, that hosts and is now called the Singapore and Southeast Asian Pipe Band Championship. So that's held once a year. I believe it's in the summer. But there wasn't a lot of other competitive events on any kind of circuit. I know today Singapore actually has two major piping events. One is specifically held for the Boys Brigades, known as the Boys Brigade Pipe Band Festival. It's only within the Boys Brigade bands, of which there are about 50, if you believe it, in a small country. And then you have, of course, the Southeast Asian Pipe Band Championships, which brings in a lot of regional bands from Hong Kong, China, Japan, for example. So it's nice to see that the competitive element is starting to build, and a lot of bands and players are starting to cross-pollinate. For example, I was roped in about 2 years ago to help write scores for a grade 3 competition band in Singapore, and some of the players actually flew every summer to Australia and New Zealand to play with bands there, because obviously they have bigger circuits the way Canada does. So.
They get more experience in competing.
Of course, and also understanding and bringing outside influences in, and vice versa, bringing Asian influences out.
Let's talk a little bit about your time playing in bands here on this side of the ocean.
Sure.
So were you with the Ottawa Police Band before the RCMP band?
Yes.
Okay. So you joined, at some particular point, you joined the Ottawa Police Band.
I was invited to join that, so.
Now let's make something clear to our listeners who may not be familiar with how this all works. So you don't have to be a police officer necessarily to be in the Ottawa Police Band, correct?
That's correct.
Or any of these bands.
The majority of police and military band, pipe band members across the country are volunteers. The
civilians,
civilian volunteers.
Yeah,
they wear a uniform because it's part of the regimental context, just like any pipe band, a civilian pipe band would wear a uniform. They do get some funding, or certainly the moral support of the regimental commander, or in police bands, the case of the police chiefs, or I played for the RCMP for. The RCMP has 8 bands across the country, so each band is kind of within a division. Each division might be within a province. So each divisional commanding officer would provide some of the funding support as well as the moral support to constitute a band organization. But the majority of players across these bands, people often think that just because they wear a uniform, they are the police officers or military serving members. But in fact, most of them aren't.
Right. Now, when you came over and started participating with the Ottawa Police Band, let's say, differences between your experience there and your experience back in Singapore? Any difference in the way that you were taught, the way you performed, the way you competed? Yeah, okay.
Actually, my first band I joined here was the Highlanders Pipe Band. So it was another civilian band attached to the Legion in Canada. And I was there playing with them, competing with them. They were a grade 5 band, and I ended up getting roped or invited to teach a weekly drumming workshop for the tenors and basses. And I was teaching that for about a year and a half before someone invited me to the Ottawa Police Band. I found that the police bands, and one of the reasons, like getting into the police band world, was very similar in terms of the context of the bands that I grew up in. I'll clarify that from a drill perspective. So the Boys Brigade, for example, was very drill oriented, and we did a lot of drill. We playing was as important, if not less important, than the look. And certainly having spent the last 11 years with the RCMP pipe band, we always say that the sight and sound, you want to have both about equal, but if anything, the sight itself, the fact that we show up in the world famous red serge, well kitted out, looking good, that is almost 60% of the battle won. And the music doesn't have to be a grade 1 level. For the listeners out there, grade 1 is usually the senior amateurs, so the professional bands. We don't have to sound professional. The RCMP bands are nowhere near professional in terms of the quality of sound, but we play simple music well, and we do our drill well, and we look good. So the deportment and the dress is a huge part of what pipe bands do. And I find that the police pipe bands mirrored a lot of the drill culture that I came from, spending 8 years in Asia in pipe bands there.
Sidetracking a little bit with a question for our listeners. When you're talking about grade 1 bands and grade 5 bands, just for the sake of comparison. So grade 1 would be the top echelon of amateur performers in pipe
Correct.
bands.
So,
how would you categorize the difference between a grade 1 band and a grade 5 band?
A grade 5 band, using the RSPBA, or the Royal Scottish Pipe Band Association kind of ranking system, grade 5 would be considered juvenile, grade 4 novice, grade 3 will be your intermediate, grade 2 is amateur, and then grade 3 is amateur, grade 2 senior amateur, and grade 1 being the professional level. Grade 5 bands typically across North America, but definitely within my context, I'm understanding it within like Ontario. Most of these grade 5 bands are street bands. So they do a lot of parades. They play the very common tunes. Within here in Ontario, most of the pipers and drummers who compete are part of the Pipers and Pipe Band Society of Ontario. And so the PBBSO has actually created standardized scores and music. So being a grade 5 drummer, your expectation or piper is to learn to be able to go out there and play the mass bands at the Highland Games, for example. As you climb that ladder, the musicality and the technicality of the drum scores become a little bit more sophisticated. The sets become a bit more sophisticated. We start to play medleys when you get to about the amateur level, grade 3 and up. You start to put together anywhere from a 4-minute medley to a 7.5 minute long medley when you're in grade 1. Also, in terms of the syncopation, in terms of you have more challenging technical elements of the pipe band repertoire. You have things like the ensemble that comes into play, where you want to hear all 3 elements and sections of the band come together. You also have things like the tenor drummers. So I was a tenor drummer for years, where how you flourish, how many drummers you have, and how you blend the sight with the music is going to be a key element.
We're going to take a break from our conversation and play a medley performed by the Rob Roy Pipe Band while they were in New York City. The Rob Roy Pipe Band with a medley of Orange and Blue, Keel Row, and Tail Total. You're listening to The Kingstonian on CFRC at 101.9 and streamed from our website at www.cfrc.ca. Our guest is Darryl Lim, and my name is Dave Cunningham. When it comes to participating with Rob Roy, so you came down to New York City with us to participate in the Tartan Day Parade.
As a guest.
And you came in the roles as a drum major.
Mm-hmm.
Now, for those who do not know what a drum major does in a pipe band, and keeping in mind this is radio as opposed to television, can you describe what your role would be in the context of a band as a drum major?
Sure. The drum major has many elements. From a sight perspective, typically when you see a band marching down the street, the drum major is the first person you see. He's the person in front of the band carrying a mace. And that's what we call it here. Some people call it a scepter. It's really called the mace. And the mace is used both as a, for some of the bands I've been with, like the military bands, it's actually part of your regalia. It's part of the uniform that you wear, but it's also part of the regalia. It usually has a regimental, it carries part of the history of the regiment. For example, to sidetrack a little, the RCMP maces that are carried on parade, they are made in full weight. And inside, if you take the crown off the mace, inside each RCMP mace lies a scroll that's handwritten of the names of the fallen officers who have died in the line of duty. So
really?
There is a very well-honored tradition for the reason the mace is being carried. It's part of the honor. Same thing with the RCMP drums. We carry colors because the RCMP is one of the few police regiments of police forces in the world that actually served in the war. So we carry honors, battle honors, similar to military bands. In a civilian band like the Rob Roy Pipe Band and other pipe bands that I'm a drum major in, the drum major's role is to lead the band, so to give orders on parade to tell the band to turn left or to turn right or to turn around, as we call it, counter march. It's also to provide the dressing, so making sure that the band is in step, making sure that giving we call it the cutoff. So it's essentially raising the mace in a 45-degree angle, and that tells the drummers to give what the band calls the double tap, so that the pipers can take a break while they're marching.
Now, qualities that a good drum major would need to have would include a loud voice, because you've got to make your voice heard over top of a lot of extraneous noise, and sometimes the pipes and drums themselves.
Of course, and certainly being able to yell, I'd say at least as far back as about 50 meters deep. I've been to Highland Games where you have pipers and drummers stacked 10 deep, and I'm leading one whole wave at Maxville, and I'm yelling at the top of my lungs, and the drummers may not hear me, but eventually when they hear the pipes strike up and the pipers start moving, people kind of follow along. You also have to learn to teach some drill. So part of the drum major's responsibility is teaching drill and making sure that your members are, in step and learn how to keep in step and how to turn, for example, as a band. There are all these little intricacies to that. I went through the RCMP drum major course in 2013. So one of the roles and responsibilities of a drum major that is behind the scenes is doing a lot of the planning, doing a lot of the route and site advance. So for example, New York City, walking the entire route of the parade once over with the organizer before actually doing the same march with the band. So I know exactly where I need to take the band and where we're going.
Okay.
And there's also a lot of the administrative tasks. For example, one of my roles is as a drum major with another band is I manage a lot of their equipment. So making sure that the equipment and the uniform parts are in working order, because my role is to make sure my band members look good on parade.
Now, we all go down to New York City and we get ready to participate in the Tartan Day Parade. Now, you've already been there once before. You've done this parade before.
In 2005, yeah.
You were invited to join Rob Roy because they don't have a drum major, and you were invited to join as the drum major, which adds a lot to the look of the parade, and also makes it a little easier, I would gather, with respect to the pipe major and getting those commands out. What's your view of the Tartan Day Parade? What do you like about the Tartan Day Parade?
It is one of the largest Tartan Day parades that I participated in. It's certainly become it's become larger since the first Tartan Day Parade in New York City that I participated in 2000. I want to say 2006 with the High Limits Pipe Band at the time. Marching down in New York City is an experience unto itself. I've done that a few times now in a few different parades. I've done it for St. Patrick's Day Parade in 2013, and I've done it now for the New York City Parade. Going down, marching down essentially across 6 lanes of New York City with the skyscrapers flanking you on each side. And of course, with large crowds of people. I participated in other Tartan Day parades where you just don't have the volume of people or the same kind of atmosphere.
I was talking to somebody else about participating in the parade itself, and I was asking about whether or not they were watching the Grand Marshal of the parade, who this year was Sir Billy Connolly.
Yes.
And the piper said, well, I wasn't paying any attention at all to him because I was more concerned about watching the pipe major and paying attention to what I was doing. Does the drum major have the opportunity to grab a little look around as you are marching down the road?
At some point, yes. It's what I call part of my peripheral. I need to know what's going on. For example, marching down a public street, the good thing for this parade was the New York City Police Department had the streets blocked, all 10 blocks of it, which is nice to have because I've certainly done parades in New York City before where streets weren't blocked. There would be cross traffic. So as the drum major's responsibility, if you're going to lead the band, you need to make sure you're not leading it into oncoming traffic.
That's right.
So yes, I do get to scan left and right. And at times, for example, I have to anticipate when the reviewing stand's coming up or when the judges stand's coming up. There were points on the route that we did stop as a band so that our dancers could come in front and do a short little performance. I believe we stopped 4 times during that route. And also there was one reviewing stand for them to announce who we were from Canada, and one double-decker bus straight in front where we made the final turn. And I made sure that we stopped the band with enough time so that I could present a salute. I know that in military bands and regimental police bands, it's more common that a salute's a form of respect. But for me, it's a civilian band. And as a band leader, it's a way for me to thank them for inviting us there.
Okay.
We were, after all, the only Canadian contingent this year.
That's right. Now, setting aside the musical component of the trip to New York City, what do you like about being in New York City? Or what did you like about this particular trip?
I love New York City in general. I go there quite often for both shopping as well as for Broadway shows. In fact, I was in New York City at Black Friday just 6 months before this trip, doing a lot of shopping and a lot of Broadway watching. And but this particular trip, as well as some of the other festivals I've come to town for, so the other big one would be the St. Patrick's Day Parade. I find that there's New York City is a very big city that is busy 24/7, and sometimes people forget. When you walk down the street in a kilt and no one really bats an eyelid, but then you suddenly have 25 band members walking down the street carrying bagpipes, kilts, and a mace. And people start going, what's going on here? It's probably something that's going on. And it's nice that you can have a chance to educate people and tell them it's Tartan Day. And they go, what's Tartan Day? Well, Tartan Day is a celebration of the Scottish tartan. It's a little bit ironic that, some guy like me who doesn't look very Scottish walks down the street, and then I have people coming up to me, Irish people coming up to me saying, what's Tartan Day for?
What I was amazed about was the hustle and bustle of New York City, and people are running from here and running to there and going to work or going shopping or whatever, and they would stop, pull out the iPhones and take film or pictures of the people walking down the street. And it seemed to attract the attention of almost everybody that the parade walked by.
Yes. I mean, it's certainly an uncommon sight to see a pipe band and having New York City police lock down 10 blocks smack in the heart of downtown. We were marching For the viewers' context, we're marching down the Avenue of the Americas, which is 6th Avenue. So it's right in the heart of Manhattan. And of course it happens on a weekend, but having the band had arrived on the Thursday, and I remember walking up that same street on the Friday, looking at cars, and everywhere was a jam of people and cars. And I go, wow, they're actually going to lock down 10 blocks of this same jam-packed street on the Saturday for us to come down on. And I think that is a feat unto itself in New York City.
Now, you have participated with a lot of different bands in a lot of different places, and you've worked with a lot of different people of all ages, I would guess, in terms of the bands that you've been a part of. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious to know your thoughts on what participating in a parade like this in New York City does to the people in the Rob Roy Band who are new to the music, new to playing, whether it be pipes or drums, or dancing for that matter. What does it do to them, for them?
I think there is going to be a wow factor that each person can take away, whether or not they are an experienced piper, drummer, or band member, whether or not it's their first time in New York, or perhaps they're like me, they've done it a few times for a few different parades. Every time I do a parade in New York City, it's a wow factor. But I've been to so many fantastic places in my 26 years with pipe bands. I was about 9 months ago, I was in Shanghai, for example, playing at the Shanghai Tourism Festival with the RCMP band. And again, we were playing to throngs of people. We had it was my first time ever playing in a pipe band. We were about 50 strong. We had a contingent of 75 local Chinese police officers actually forming a barrier around us, pushing crowds back in order for us to move. And just the millions and thousands of people that showed up, and everyone had their own iPhone pointed up.
Right.
For me, playing in a pipe band, especially when it's just a pipe band doing street parades, that does a little bit of competition, but a little bit of street parades. The street parades for me is a huge wow factor. It's a wow factor, I think, for the people listening to these bands. And when they find out, of course, that we're Canadian, we get these extra cat calls and extra hoots, because for them, it's not just local band, that we took the time. And I remember a few people coming up to me in New York City saying, "You guys are Canadian. Thank you so much for taking the time to come all the way to our city to perform in this parade." And I like that feeling of being part of a group. That's not just me marching down the street. It's making the band look good, and the band makes me look good, and we all have a good time. And yes, we did, I think, 2 parades, and we did a little performance at Bryant Park. But ultimately, we also had a lot of fun together. Mm-hmm. And part of being a band, for people who are either maybe thinking of joining a band or new to a pipe band, really being part of the band is, to sound cliche and stealing that line from the movie Drumline, it is one band, one sound, but ultimately being a part of a larger group where it's not just the individual really teaches you a lot about camaraderie and learning to do things together as a team.
Working together.
On
that note, I think we will end our little conversation, and I want to thank you very much for participating.
Thanks for having me.
Our guest in this episode, Darryl Lim, a resident of Ottawa, who was guest drum major for the Rob Roy Pipe Band and Highland Dancers during their trip to New York City in April for the Tartan Day Parade. Theme music for the program is Stasis Oasis, a tune written and performed by Kingston musician Tim Aylesworth. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions about any of our episodes, please send a note to the Kingstonian Podcast Facebook page. This is Dave Cunningham from Kingston, Ontario. Thank you for listening. Until next time.